In this week's video, I'm going to show you how to paint this really pretty white tulip using gouache, so let's get started. I've already done my drawing like this, and I always trace down my drawings to save time. You can of course draw them freehand, but I do provide you with a reference photograph so that you can trace it down this way. Details later on how you can obtain it. Today I'm using this Strathmore mixed media paper and my little ceramic palette here, along with a selection of brushes. And just a few paints today. I'm using HOLBEIN gouache, and I've mixed up a few colours here, as you can see. All the materials I'm going to be listing in the description box underneath the video, and I'll talk to you about them as I work through. We have a clean glass of water, and let's get mixing. Now the trick with gouache is of course to add as little water as you need. Now I found this out the hard way by adding a little bit too much water when I started to paint with this particular medium. So the trick is just add enough water to get that paint moving. If you're used to working with watercolour, this can be a really difficult transition, but just keep going and get that texture right. I've mixed up a yellow tone and a blue tone with a bit of white here to create this kind of muted green. I'm using this brush to just paint in that colour straight onto the paper, and then the lighter colour to the inside edge here, just to give that first application of paint a little bit of variation. Now, unlike watercolour, to lighten the paint you will need to add white paint. So if you are thinking of investing in some gouache, I highly recommend getting an extra tube of white paint, as I found out the hard way, because you will need a lot of this to mix up your colours. Using the same kind of muted tone, I apply this colour around the outside of the pencil line like this, just using that brush. Notice how thick that paint is when you apply that first layer, but you just need to add a tiny bit of water just to get that paint moving. You'll know when it feels right because it's not too thin on the paper as you would have with watercolour. So I'm just taking this colour all over this base colour. Remember, we will still be building up these colours once the first wash of paint is dry. This is my number 1 spotter brush, and I'm just using the lighter tone here. This has got a little bit more paint, more white paint in it, and just to add a little bit of shape on this first leaf. You can blend the colours together by just wetting your brush and patting it dry in the same way that you would blend watercolour, but this time you need to use a really light touch. I really love this paper from Strathmore. I've used it a couple of times in my tutorials now, and I find it really great for using gouache. I've added a tiny bit of that yellow to the mix here, again to give a little bit of variation on that leaf to stop it from looking flat. I'm going to do the same on the other leaf here. Notice how I've got this tiny little puddle of water in my palette. That just helps me control the amount of water I add to the gouache, and I'm applying this light colour here on the folded section of the leaf. I think the thing is here not to be too fussy about the colours that I'm using. Just use any green that you have, or of course you can mix your own by adding these two colours that I've got here. I'm actually using Ultramarine Deep, and I think it's Permanent Yellow Deep there. But any colours that you have to mix up your own green tones work really well. But of course the trick is to keep adding different ratios of the paint so that you've got different tones and variations within that colour to stop it from looking flat. These gouache paints blend together so well, and they're an absolute joy to use. I really love them. They are so different from watercolour, but honestly I urge you to try gouache if you haven't tried it before, because you really will see the difference in using this compared to the other medium. Now of course I adore watercolour, I am a watercolour artist, but oh my goodness, it's so good to use this from time to time. You can see here I'm using a damp brush to blend out the outside edge. I wanted this to have a really soft look. Continuing to mix the colours together to vary those greens, adding a little bit of yellow as necessary because I wanted the stem of the tulip to have a kind of more vibrant look. At the start of this video I told you that I traced down this drawing and you can have access to the outline and the reference photograph, and really easy. All you need to do is wait until the end of this video. I will put it right at the end of this video after the outro, where you can pause the video, screenshot it, and you can print it out that way. Notice how I'm just varying that colour, just picking up that yellow tone and mixing it in. There's no rhyme or reason here. I'm just kind of making it up just to give that variation, using that reference photograph as a guide. I'm putting some white here and adding a little bit more blue, so that we've got a really pale bluey green mix here on the palette. Just going over that first wash and applying that paint with my spotter brush straight to the pencil line and blending it with a sort of really damp brush there. If you are enjoying this video, could I ask you please to give it a thumbs up? It's a way of letting YouTube know that you're enjoying my content, and it shows it to more people. Every week here on YouTube we release new content, and if this is something that interests you, you may want to consider subscribing to my channel and hitting that little bell notification, so every time I upload new content, YouTube will let you know and you won't miss out. Just carrying on this process using that little brush, mixing it up again, a nice light shade there to go in where this little fold is. You'll notice from the photograph that we have a kind of lighter area here, and again it's all about that tonal variation and making your paintings come to life by just giving that little bit of an extra boost here and there. So if you're a watercolour artist as I am, have you tried gouache before? Let me know in the comments, and if you have, what is it that you found the most difficult transition between using one medium and the other? For me, it's definitely getting used to the thickness of that paint, and it's something that once you've kind of tried a few times, once you get the hang of it, you will fall in love with it as much as I have. So let me know in the comments if you've kind of used both mediums and which one you find the easiest. This time I'm adding a tiny bit of black paint to the existing mix because I want a darker value along with that sort of yellowy green mix that we did earlier on. I'm applying this to the outside edge of the stem of the tulip because at the moment it's looking a little bit too flat. By adding this shadow tone, it makes that stem sort of stand out and it makes it look a little less flat. Notice how I'm using the damp brush just to use a very light touch to merge that paint together. Continuing that blending, you can see how muted this tone is. Just by using these few colours you can achieve so many different shades and tones. And just blending it through with that soft brush. So I'm just using my number 2, this is a number 2 size pointed round brush. This is a synthetic brush from Rosemary. It's a watercolour brush, and I'm mixing up white with a tiny bit of black here. I'm going to be working on each petal one by one. This time I'm just adding the white paint to start with a tiny bit of black, and this is where we can start to build up all those tonal values to make that white look really three-dimensional. So to begin with, I'm just adding white paint first of all, right up to the pencil line with a tiny bit of water mixed into that gouache. Pencil line first and then filling it in later on. If I were just painting this myself, I would cover each of the petals as I work through, but because this is a video and you won't be able to see what I'm doing, I'm just painting each of the little folds and the little petals one by one so that you can still see the pencil line. But if you are painting something like this yourself, you'll be able to see the pencil line by taking this colour all over the petals instead of doing them individually, because you can still see that underlying pencil line. But just for the purposes of this tutorial, and in case you can't see what I'm doing, this is why I'm doing it this way, but of course, whichever works for you. You can see I've added a tiny bit of yellow paint there on my palette. I'm going to add this to the bottom part, as you can see me doing here. And it doesn't matter if the paint is still wet, not like watercolour if you don't want it to bleed, because it won't. You can have full control over your paint this way. Cleaning my brush, pattern it dry in the same way that I would if I were working with watercolour. If botanical painting is something that interests you and you would prefer to have a more in-depth tutorial, we do have a Patreon where every month we release brand new content. The content you won't find here on YouTube. All our videos over on Patreon are exclusive to my patrons. They are a much slower pace, and in case this is something that interests you, let's just take a look. If you love botanical painting and want to know more, then you may want to join our Patreon. We have different membership levels so that you can take your botanical painting to the next level. With our Clematis level, you will have a full-length, in-depth tutorial every month, and if you'd like to make even more progress, then check out our Rose level, where we now have a mentorship offering feedback to help you grow. You won't find any of our Patreon tutorials here on YouTube, and you can cancel your membership at any time. So if you want to take your botanical painting to the next level, then take a look. I'll put the link in the description underneath this video. So carrying on the process, taking that white paint just all over this little petal here. I'm using my number 2 pointed round here to do this. I'm purposely leaving that little gap, as I said earlier on, just so you can see the shape, and taking it all over this petal. And just blending in a tiny bit of that yellow tone. Everything's dry, and I've done the same to the other petals. You notice that I've added a tiny bit of yellow to that white tone to create a cream shade to one of the petals there. I did feel that it was looking a little bit different from the others, which is why I've done this when I looked at the photograph. Mixing up a pale grey with plenty of white and a tiny bit of black to add some variation here and a little bit of detail, as you can see me doing. Outlining each petal and creating some shapes and a little bit of form by just adding that paint as I see fit. I'm not going strictly to the photograph, it's just adding a bit of tonal variation where I feel roughly it is needed. The beauty of gouache, of course, is if you make a mistake, you can just paint over it. You don't have to retain your whites in the way that you do with watercolour. With watercolour, if you're painting a highlight, you tend to paint around that shape, which is negative painting, but you don't have to do that with gouache. You can just go in with your white paint and paint it on, which is so much easier. Just outlining this little petal here, I think it's a little bit too strong at the moment, and I will blend it out in a little while, but you can either blend out that colour by painting a white over it, or of course just use a tiny bit of water to blend those colours together. When you're blending your colours together using a damp brush, use a very light touch. Adding another little bit of petal here on the outside edge, which I'd forgotten to put in earlier on. This is just the white on its own, and as I've got the white on the brush, I've decided to add a little bit more tonal contrast here and there, and blending it in with that damp brush as I've done all the way through. If you do enjoy working with gouache, I will put a playlist right at the end of this video so that you can click through to that and take a look at the others that we've got here on the channel. Adding some more white here. And just using that grey tone to add a bit more contrast. And taking some of that white colour over that creamy colour mix that I did earlier on, again just to make it a little bit more natural looking. And outlining a couple of the petals. mixing up a little bit more green. And adding a little bit of detail here and there. Adding a smidgen of white paint to that green mix. And now we can tackle the middle of the tulip. Notice the colours that I'm picking up from my palette here. And again, using that same sort of blending technique by applying the paint straight onto the paper and using the damp brush to merge them together. Adding a tiny bit more blue to that mix and a tiny bit of black to add some definition to the bottom part of the tulip. So you can see there that I'm just using the same process, darkening up those values with a little bit of black to add some definition. I'm using a liner brush to do this. I did feel that my spotter brush wasn't quite sharp enough at this point. As I said, I will link all of the brushes and materials that I'm using in the description box so that you can check them out for yourself. Sharpening up that outside edge there. You can see I've added a tiny bit of red paint to my palette there. Now you haven't got to add this, but there is in the photograph a tiny bit of the red colour, which is why I've decided to put that in, but of course it's not absolutely necessary. I've watered it down quite a bit because I didn't want that colour to be too strong. I've also added a tiny bit of yellow, and I'm going to add a little bit more yellow in a minute so that I can strengthen up that yellow tone up towards the base of the petals. Just adding a bit more detail here and there. At this point, as always, I'm going to stop talking and let you watch the rest of this video in peace, listening to some music. Remember to stay right until the end of this video so that you can pause it and screenshot the outline and the reference photograph, as well as see the finished painting. And of course, you can click through to that playlist if you want to. Once again, thank you for watching. Could I ask you to give it a thumbs up if you'd enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.